In this episode, we're going to talk about interactivity and how a user of a browser interacts with a server by sending data. So far, the only mode of interactivity that we've talked about is that of clicking on links. The only thing that a user can do to interact and have the content get updated is to click on a link. But now we're going to see how more data can be communicated over the browser to the server by the user. So a form looks like this, and I'm sure that you have seen one already in many different occasions. So this one is a typical registration form that asks the user to provide name, address, information, check over here on some options and check some checkbox and possibly enter comments before sending the form. Now, what kind of coding, what kind of markup coding is going to have a browser render something like this? This is what we're going to see in this lesson. So forms are used on the web to collect information from users. The information is then sent to a program that is running on a web server and generally referred to as the CGI script. The CGI stands for Common Gateway Interface, and it can be written in any language that will run on the server, such as PHP, Perl, Ruby, Node.js, and all sorts of scripting languages that will run on a server. The CGI script receives the data from the web page, then acts on that data to perform a certain task. So here's how this happens graphically. The user fills out the form and clicks the submit button. The browser takes the information that was entered by the user, it packs it up in a certain way, and then sends it over to the server. The server will receive all that information, it will process it, and whatever output is generated by that processing will be sent back to the browser as a response. Here's the different parts of a form. These are text boxes. They provide input, they render an input box in order for the user to enter typed information. A drop-down list will be one simple box with a drop-down button and which will then present a list of options to choose from, and that chosen option will become the value that will be displayed in this box. These are radio buttons. They are radio buttons because they belong to a group, and only one of them can be selected at a time from the whole group. So if you make your choice and then you decide that you want to change your choice and you click on something else, the previous one will be cancelled and a new one will be selected. Checkboxes, you put check marks in them independently from each other. This is what we call a text area. It can be as big as you want, including multiple lines. Unlike the input text boxes, these can consist of multiple lines, and you can define how many you would like to display. Then we have buttons. The most common ones are the send button or submit button, and usually there is a button for cancelling the form or resetting the form. So in order to render forms, you need HTML markup tags. The very first things that you're going to need is the form tags. there is a form tag and a corresponding closing one that mark where the form begins and where the form ends. These tags do not render anything in particular. The only thing that they do is they mark where the form begins and where it ends. Here is an example where we have a form tag that starts here and ends there. So these tags mark the segment of the HTML code that corresponds to this form, but otherwise it's nothing that actually renders, although the various elements that appear here for the form do render. This is, for example, how that form actually renders. As you see, there are different form elements, but there's nothing in particular, any border or different color or anything that indicates where the font tags were. Now, you do need various fields that designate the particular inputs that the user can use to interact. And the input tag is the one to use in this case. So here's the structure of a form. You have a form opening tag, you have a form closing tag. Within it, you may have all sorts of HTML tags, but somewhere you need to have some input tags that indicate where the user will enter information that will be required for the interaction. The input tag in this case that you see here is responsible for this input box, and this one is responsible for this input box. The form tag requires some attributes. The reason is that we need to, at minimum, specify an action part, which will be the handler for the form. This will be a URL, but typically that URL will be pointing to a file on some server that will be executable, and by executing it, it will process the information of the form. We also need this attribute, which is the method for doing the communication, which has either of two different values. It's either a get or a post. Most common one is the post, but get works just as well. The name identifies the form. It is not necessary for it to be there. It is something that can be omitted with no problem. But if for any reason we need to refer to this form in the coding, as we're going to see later on, especially when we're talking about JavaScript, then we will need to be able to identify the form, and that provides an identifier for it. So to summarize again, the name provides an identifier for the form, the action provides a script or a handler for processing the input that is provided for the form, and the method controls how the browser sends data to the web server for the CGI script. In the get method, the browser packages the form data by appending it to the end of the URL that is specified in the action property. The browser strings up all the information that it gets into a huge string that is formatted in a very specific way that we call query string. And that string is then appended to the end of the URL, and that is what the browser is using to access the server. In the post method, the information is sent in a separate data stream. So while with the get method, the data are sent along with the access to the script, in the post method, it is sent as a different data stream. The input tag that we mentioned earlier also requires a whole bunch of attributes. The name identifies the particular input, but it is required because we need to know the particular data that is collected through this form, which element it was that collected it. So at minimum, you have to specify the name for the input. The value will be an attribute that specifies a text that will be a pre-populated value for this particular input. Often it might be a value that cannot be changed and it is simply prearranged and the user simply sends it or not to the server. We will see examples of this. The input tag requires certain attributes as well. The very first one is the name. This is something that is required. It is an identifier for the input and it tells for what particular input the given data that the user entered was provided. So there has to be a way to link data to specific boxes for input, and that name is the one that does the job. The value attribute is going to be whatever the user has typed or entered for that particular input. And optionally, it may be something that is pre-populated. So the value attribute may be there and maybe not. If it is there, it is usually to provide a pre-populated input which the user can change. In some cases, this value cannot be changed, and the only thing that the user can do is either send it or not send it, as in the cases of the checkbox that we're going to see later on. The size indicates how big the input box is going to be rendered. The default is 20 characters, but you may specify a smaller box or a bigger box by setting the size to be, say, 10 or 30, which means respectively 10 or 30 characters. This does not limit the input. It does not limit the user from entering up to that many characters. The user can enter more characters. It will simply scroll, but it only has to do with how big of a box is used to render the particular input. The max length is the maximum number of characters the user can input, and this does limit the size of the input that will enter in that for that input. The type is one out of a predetermined different classes of input. The most common type of input is the text boxes. A text box appears with this code like this. So input is the tag. The type for a text box is text. So this is the actual value for the type attribute. Then there has to be a name, and over here there should be some name which is going to be some text string and some value that may be optional if we would like to pre-populate a text box like this example shows. So in this example we have a bunch of different text type of inputs that will display text boxes. They are given names, but they're given no value attributes. And they render like this. They render like this. Now, notice that if I go to the original code and I put over here a value property and I say that the value of this is going to be, then I go save it, and then I go render it again, and now you see Now, upon reloading the form, I have a name that has been prepopulated into this field. Now, this is something that I can change, as you see. But the whole point is that it provides a prepopulated value. Now, normally, the name provides an identifier for the info that is typed into this box. Now, you can think of the name as being the name of a variable which will have the input that is provided by the user as its value. And the value is, again, what will be prepopulated and what eventually will be sent to the server to be processed by the CGI script. One very special category of text boxes are the hidden boxes. In this case, the type attribute takes on the value hidden. That will be the value that it will take on. And otherwise, everything will be the same as with the classic text boxes that we saw before, except that in this case, the value is not optional. A value must be provided. The reason is that this text box will not really be displayed. That is where the name hidden comes from. It is not going to display anything. It will be there, but it will be totally invisible to the user. So why is it used? It is used to provide a prepopulated input that the user should not change, but have it submitted along with all the rest of the user data to the server. In this way, it was possible to track a user or a browser session by having the server serve a HTML document to the user that might have such hidden elements with prepopulated values that identified either the user or the session. And so whenever the user would send the information back to the server, all this hidden information would be tagged along and it would be identifying some continuity with processing. For example, if you're shopping on a website and you're putting stuff in your cart, every browser action happens with a consequent return from the server. But when in the future the user tries to put something new in his cart or her cart, then how does the server know who is the user and whose cart this item has to go in? So the cart ID might be a hidden element that is provided like a hidden text box along with the form to a user. So whenever the user sends whatever information back to the server, for example, add this item to my cart, then the browser from that hidden field and the value that that hidden field had, which should be unique for different users, would know which cart the item has to go into. For example, if we go back to our form and we add a new element like this. So let's make this one a hidden name. We're going to put something different for this one. And then let's save this form and go and render it again. So refreshing this, you see displays the values as pre-populated values like we're supposed to. However, let's go over here and turn this one into a hidden element. So this one will be hidden now. And we're going to save this and go back and refresh and see what happened. This text box disappeared. And the reason that it disappeared is because now it is labeled as hidden. Now, this is not hidden because this is part of the renderable text, as you see here. This is just text to be rendered. But this one, this text box, is designated as hidden. Radio buttons. The radio buttons have the same structure like the text boxes, except that their type value is radio. And the value attribute is not optional. You have to provide the value, because the only thing that the user can do is to simply select that radio button or not. But otherwise, that user cannot specify a value for the radio button. So a value has to be specified beforehand, and the only thing that the user can do is select it or unselect it, check it or not check it. So an additional keyword is possible here, checked or nothing. If this is left blank, then this radio button will simply be an empty radio button that can be clicked to be checked and then deselected. But if the checked keyword appears here, then it will be a radio that will be selected from the get-go. Radio buttons provide a list of choices from which the user makes a selection. Usually, a radio button is not appearing by itself. They come as a group, and they all have the same name if they refer to the same group, but they differ in the values. So to recap, the radio button has a name that has to be the same for all the radio buttons that are in the same group. There has to be a value. That's not optional. There has to be a value. And there might be optionally a checked flag for one of the radio buttons that makes that particular button the default. Back to our example, you see over here a section that contains radio buttons, and they are all inputs of type radio, and they all have the same name, my color, but they have different values. The way that this renders is as follows. They render as 4 different buttons. One can be selected, and then every time I click on a different one, the previous one will be deselected and the new one will be selected. Now, what I will do is I will go and copy all of this and paste it and change it to something else. Say, for example, I'll make this one about food, and I will change the name of these to food and this to food. Alright, so let me save this and then go and render it again and see how it renders now. Now I have 2 sets of buttons. Notice one thing. If I go and select this one, then selecting any of these will invalidate the previous choice. However, if I make any selection over here, you see anything I do affects only this group, but does not affect this group. I can go and make whatever changes I want over here, but it will not affect the other group. And the only reason that this happens is not because these happen to be in the same area. It is simply because they have the same name. All of these have the name food, and all of these have the name color. That is what groups them together. But they all have different values. So whenever I select one, when I submit the form, then the value of the one that was selected is going to be the one that will be submitted for the particular named input. So this one is named my color, this one is named food. So if I go to my form, when I submit this form, then if I have made these selections over here, then the purple value will be sent along with the identifier my color, and the spaghetti value will be sent with the input named food. Checkboxes. Checkboxes are like the radio buttons, except that they appear as little square boxes instead of round ones, and they do not come in groups. Each one is individual and independent of any other, and the only thing that you can do is either check it or uncheck it. So the checkboxes have the type checkbox. They do need a name and they do need a value. A predetermined value, must be associated with a particular checkbox. You can also include the flag checked or leave it blank, in which case the checkbox will be pre-selected or not. So the only thing that the user can do about this is either check it or uncheck it, and that will cause the particular value to be sent as the value of this identifier to the server, along with all the other inputs entered by the user. Or if it is left unchecked, then this will simply be ignored as if it did not exist. So checking it will send it to the server, unchecking it will simply ignore it and not send it to the server. The server is not going to even see that if it is not checked. Here is an example. In this case, we have some checkboxes over here, which have been identified as checkboxes. They have different names, and their values are certain strings. In this case, yes and or okay or no thank you. And two of them, this one and this one, have been marked to be checked by default on loading. And that can change, of course, but they've been identified like that for loading. So if we go to the rendering again and we render this, you will see that the checkboxes appear over here with this one already checked and this one not checked. But I can change this. Of course, I can change all of these as I like. So once the form is submitted, then what is going to happen is that the values for the checked boxes will be submitted along with the named identifiers for the checkboxes. The text area allows a user to send multiple lines of text or extended text to the server as input. The text area is a special tag called text area, and it has an opening and a closing part. The text area tag requires a name. You have to provide a name in order to identify the particular input, and you can optionally specify the size of the text box in terms of number of columns and or number of rows. Specify whether the text will naturally wrap or not, and break lines in order to just stay fit within the box. And then optionally you can specify some default text, which will be the pre-populated value of the text area. or you can leave it blank, in which case there will be no pre-populated value. So this element allows users to enter multiple lines of text as input. The name will be the identifier for this particular input. So imagine the name providing a variable whose value will be all that huge string that consists of all the data that is entered in that box. The rows and the columns specify the size, and the wrap specifies whether the text will be breaking off and wrapping up. So off will turn off text wrapping, text will not be wrapping, and you would need to scroll to see it, unless, of course, the user provides hard line breaking keystrokes. Soft will turn text wrapping on, and hard will turn text wrapping on and also sends this information to the server. The soft will wrap the text to fit it within the text box, but it will not include this wrapping information when submits to the server. Let's see an example over here. Let's say I go and type text area, and the name will be comments. It will be 30 columns, and it would be 3 rows. And I'll have a pre-populated value here, and then the text area will close like this. There. So I save this and I go and render it. And this is what it renders like. So I have this text box here, and it has this pre-populated value, which I can change. And as you see, I can enter line breaks by just typing line breaks, and I can continue typing and put more line breaks, and as you see, I can go and type more stuff, and it will scroll if it cannot fit in the text box. So this is what the text box does. Selectors or drop-down lists. This is an element that allows you to select one out of a certain group of predefined values that are provided as a drop-down list. The tag is the select tag. It has to have a name. It is not necessary to have a size attribute or this multiple flag. It has an opening part and it has a closing part. The number of elements that appear on the list have to be specified as options in a list like this. An example is this one. You see, I have a select tag, it has a name, and then it has options, which provide the options that will be shown as the drop-down list. So rendering that, it's this, and here is the list. Once I click on this, then all of these items that were options will appear over here, and I can select any one of them. Then the selected value will become the value of the identifier that is associated with this element when it is sent to the server. So the identifier over here is my team. So imagine a variable called my team, where its value becomes whatever was selected out of this list. And that will be sent to the server along with all other data. Now, this shows the proper way the formal way of defining options. They're defined with a tag option and then a value attribute, and then with an option that's provided over here for rendering. In my example, I did things a little differently. I just provided the option tags, but I did not provide the value items. Normally, the way I should have done this would have been as follows. Option value is cents, and then of course this would have to be typically within quotes, and then give it like this. This does the same thing like this one. If you don't provide this, a browser will use this one as the option to render, to display, as well as the value to be used for the selection. But sometimes you may want to show the user one thing, but actually send to the browser some code that might not make sense otherwise. For example, let's say that this drop-down list is about items that you sell, and over here you have descriptions, but what you're sending to the server is the actual product code or the code of the item in the inventory. So for example, you may do something like this. You may say the item number ABC123, that's the code name for the item, and then this item is just a blue t-shirt, like this. So what will this do? This will display this, but when this is the selected option, then this will be the value that will be sent for this identifier or this variable. So let's save it and display it. You will see that this one now displays blue t-shirt, cents, and Zagros, etc. like before. However, if this is selected and then upon submission, the identifier my team will assume this code that corresponds to the value of the selected option. Again, this is the way it typically has to be done, but unless you want to do this trick, if what you're displaying and the value are the same, you can do it in this way because it is simpler. The size parameter or attribute indicates the number of items that the list will display in the form, without scrolling, that is. So if in our previous example we go and introduce this size attribute over here with a value, say, of 2, then when rendering this, as you see, the form is going to only display 2 items, and then you can scroll it, but every time you're going to be seeing 2 items. The multiple flag allows you to select multiple items. By using the Control or Shift keys, the user can select multiple items. For example, if we put multiple here and we save this and we go render it, then the list shows all of these items, and then we can select multiple items like this. So multiple items are selected now. Form buttons. This is a input type that displays a button which can be clicked. It is, in a way, in the same category as the radios or the checkboxes, because what the user can do is simply click on them. The difference with buttons is that they're used as triggers for programming actions, and they're very useful when used along with scripting or programming, as we're going to see later. So these are fields that perform an action when activated or triggered by the user clicking on them. The value is providing text that appears on the button. So the rendering of the button is going to be such that whatever you provide as text there will appear as a label for the button. Here is an example. An input, which is a submit type of button. Its name is submit and its value is send. When that is rendered, it shows a button here with the label send on it. I can put other buttons elsewhere, so I can copy this whole thing and paste it there. Like this. Now save this and render it again. There you go. I have a button that has the label click me, which is the value that this thing had. Now, when I click on this, nothing happens, okay, because it has not been designated as triggering any particular action. Unlike this send button, which has been designated as a submit button, and what it will do is it will submit the form to the server. Again, other than the submit, you have a reset type of button that will reset all the elements of the form, and then you have the general buttons that will indicate a general button, and we're going to see a lot more of these when we talk about scripting. So let's see these examples in action. This is the test file that I've used to make a form, and this is how it renders. Now let's say I have entered this information here, and then I submit. Upon submission, what is going to happen is all of this information will be encoded. The browser will pack all of this information and send it to the handler of the form. The handler is specified right here. So the handler of the form is going to be this file called formtest.cgi, which is going to exist in this path on this server. So all of this information is going to be packed and will be sent to this server with a request to be passed on to this program, which presumably it is going to be executable, and it's going to execute all of this code. And in case you're wondering, this file is there for my example now, but I'm not going to leave it over there because I don't want everybody from the internet going and fooling with it. So don't even try it. Now, this is what the form renders. These are the inputs that I've put in there and what I have selected. So clicking on the send, the information that I had in the form is packed by the browser, sent to this server, and then this file is responding. This is an executable code that can be executed by the server. It is not HTML. So this file sitting on this URL is receiving all the information that I submitted. It is processing it, and then it is responding with what you see over here. So I programmed this to give me this information, and then echo back to me whatever I send, exactly what I sent. So as you see, I sent Chris as the first name. My favorite theme was scents. I did check on the chocolate, so the value for the chocolate was submitted. Last name, my color, the choice for my color was submitted, and then some other things that I selected or inputted over there. So that is how it works. Earlier, we talked about hidden text boxes, which are used to pass hidden information to a web server application, like the email of the person that should receive the form, and it indicated information that the user does not see and it's not allowed to change. But another special type of input is the password. So the password type will be a text box, but the characters that are typed by the user are displayed as bullets or asterisks. That is meant as a special type of text box that will hold information that usually is meant to be a password, and therefore it needs to be encrypted and not displayed. Recall that in the case of XHTML, all tags must have a closing part. So when it comes to XHTML, the input tag is an empty tag, just like the BR and HR, etc. And therefore, you handle it the exact same way as before. So for XHTML, this closing bracket needs to have a slash in front of it to indicate that this is closing this one because of the strict standard that XHTML requires. An image type of field provides an alternative to the buttons that we saw earlier, and it allows you to use inline images that act as buttons. So say, for example, that you do not like the button that the browser by default is using to display submit or send or reset. And instead you would like to make your own button, and you use an image processing graphical application that allows you to make your own nice, good looking, colorful button, and then you want to use that one instead of the plain ones that the browser is using by default. So in order to do that, what you're going to do is you're going to use the image field. So you're going to have an input tag. The type is going to be image. You are going to need a source for this. So you're going to need a source attribute that specifies where is the file that contains the image that you would like displayed. And that would be a URL. It can reside anywhere on any server, even different servers, and anywhere in the world. That's why you can provide here a URL. Or it can be a relative URL relative to the position of the current document. You can provide a text, an identifier to it, and you can provide a value. The image, of course, is only for the purposes of rendering, but otherwise an image is not input that will be submitted to the server. Actually, in the case of an image field, the value attribute is unnecessary because it is useless. When this type of input is used, it is normally used to act like submit buttons and therefore have the form get submitted to the server. It is also providing trigger for scripting and coding that is included with HTML, as we're going to see later. But for the most part, they're there to act as buttons that are clicked, with the difference that when the form is submitted to the server, then the coordinates corresponding to the click where the user clicked inside the image are submitted as values for these variables. So whatever name you gave to this image, then name.x is the coordinate along the horizontal axis of the click from the lower left bottom of the image. So name.x will be the x coordinate in the horizontal axis of the click in terms of number of pixels from the origin of the coordinate system of the image, which is assumed to be the lower left corner of it. Respectively, whatever name you gave to this input, name.y would be the y coordinate on the vertical axis of the click in terms of pixels from the origin of the image, which is the lower left corner of the image. Now let me show you another example, which is the same one that I had there, where I have added an image type of input, this one. So this one is an input type image. The source is this file right here, which is at the same place where my this HTML file resides. I would like to display this image with a height of 60 pixels. And the name of it is going to be visit. And I have a value over here, which, as you're going to see, is totally irrelevant. It is not used. Now, if I go and render this file, this is the rendering of it. Okay? And let's go and put something here, and put something there, put something again for hobbies and stuff, check something over here. I will leave the default for this one and the defaults for the rest of them. But I'm going to click over here on the image. Now, notice that we're going to refer to the x and y axis. The x-axis is the horizontal like this, and the y-axis is the vertical like this. They form a coordinate system of pixels whose origin is right here, right at this spot, the lower left corner of the image. So if I click somewhere over here, then imagine that the click is a point that has x and y coordinates. So the x coordinate would be the number of pixels to the right of the origin where this click would project on the x-axis, and the y coordinate would be again the number of pixels from the lower left corner that you would have to climb up vertically to get to the projection of the click on the y-axis. So without any more blah blah, let's just see an example. So I'm going to click right here, and that submits the form like it did before. And now notice what I am given. I'm given all of the inputs that I put there, but notice in particular these two, the visit x and the visit y. See, they do not appear in any particular order, but notice the visit x and visit y. The visit x is the x coordinate of the click on that image, and it is 30 pixels. So it's 30 pixels to the right, and the y coordinate is 16 pixels up from the origin. Let's do it again. Go over here, and now I'm going to click over here. See, the x would be this one and the y would be this one. So if I click over here, now my x coordinate is 95 and my y coordinate is 20. As you see, the value Greece that appeared over here does not appear anywhere. One example where image fields are useful is the following. Let's say you provide a map, and then a user submits a click, and out of the click you are trying to identify what the user is interested in. So let's say that your handler, your form handler, is a program that provides reports for different regions in the US. And the HTML file, the form, is only used to allow the user to click on a map of the US and provide you the coordinates of the click. And then the handler program will use the coordinates to identify where exactly you clicked and then generate the report. Now, one other thing that I would like to talk about is a good practice for rendering form and form elements. Before we get there, let's go back to our examples and notice how our examples are a little bit awkward. So for example, you have over here, you have the rendering of the text and the boxes, but they're not aligned. You see, this one is a little bit longer text, so the box has moved over to the right a little bit. This is it's a little shorter text, so the box has moved a little bit to the left. And over here, at first it's probably a little difficult to figure out which radio button corresponds to what label. So when you render form elements like these, it is a good idea to render them in a table so as to group them together properly or to align them properly. So for example, if I go back to my example file, I can use a table to arrange these elements so they arrange properly. Here's what I mean. So what I did here is the exact same thing I had, I turned it into a table row. I put a table tag over here. I opened the table row tag here, and then table data. I included this within table data. Then the text box is on another table data, another cell of the table that is to the right of this cell that contains the first name, and then I close the row. And I will do the same for the rest of them. So what I did over here, I turned all of these entries into table rows and cells respectively. So if I save this and I go and render it, as you see now, everything is perfectly aligned. The reason is that here is an invisible table, and this is the first column, this is the second column. The longest text is going to specify the width of this column, or I can specify it myself, and then these elements appear perfectly aligned on the second column as well. I'm going to do the same thing for these as follows. Okay, so I paused it and I did this so that I won't bore you to death. And I put this code over here as follows. I created a new cell that takes the labels, and then in a new cell to the right goes the particular input element. I introduced some blank cells that have non-breaking spaces to space things out. And so as you see, I have a row that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cells, with the middle one being the blank one, and it has one label and input on the left and one label and input on the right. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make this a border 1 table so that we will see the outline of it. And I'm going to do the same one for the previous table that I had up here so that we see the outline of it. So if we go back to this and render it, here's what happens. The previous table, here's the outline of it. 2 columns with these perfectly sitting in their corresponding boxes. And then this is the new table that I made. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns. The first column is labels. Second column is the elements, the radio buttons. The third column is blank. The fourth column, it has labels again, and then again radio buttons. But they're all perfectly aligned. See, all the radio buttons are on top of each other. The size of this text no longer spoils the way things appear. And of course, I don't need the borders. I can remove them and just get the effect of the table and just simply have things looking neat without actually showing where the table is. And here it is. So now the table borders or the table outlines are not visible, and I get the arrangement that I want. So going back to our presentation, this shows that normally on a form you would like to take control of the way things appear and how you arrange things. And in order to achieve such an arrangement, you would have to use a table or even nested tables in order to make it show the way you want it to appear. In HTML5, you have some new form elements that appeared with the version 5. That is the data list. It looks like a text box, but when you start typing, it gives you a drop down of choices. Choices are in the HTML on the client side. This does not reach out to the server. There are other technologies, such as Ajax, for example, that reach out to the server to do things, but this one is only using whatever the programmer has coded into the HTML, and it does not reach out to the server. This is the way that it appears. This is the HTML for it, data list, and when you render this and you start typing, then whatever inputs were coded as options that match what you're typing appear as options to select. The required attribute. The required attribute is new in HTML5, and it can now be added to most form fields in order to force that a user provides input for that particular field. It is a very basic form of validation that provides a basic check to make sure that input has been provided for a particular field. It looks different in different browsers. So if you try to submit a form where you did not provide input for a field that includes the required attribute, then the way that the browser will object, or the way that the browser will respond to you and tell you that you cannot submit a form before you fill in this field, is different. A little bit about the program that I was running on the server earlier. That was the handler for the form. To summarize, I had some code, HTML code, that would render a particular form like this. The form with its action attribute, it was specifying a handler for it. The handler was some executable code. That code would receive whatever information the user enters in these fields and process it. Then the output would be sent back to the browser that sent the input. So providing information like this into the form and submitting it was causing that script to produce an output which was then sent back to the server. Over here, in the address part of the browser, typically that file with its whole path will be shown as if this was the URL that provided this code. Well, as a matter of fact, it is. It did provide it. It is not code that sits in any particular file. It was code that was generated by this program. It was sent to the browser for the purpose of rendering it, but then it did not exist anywhere in particular. Unlike this code here that exists in this file, in this place, and it continues to exist even after this operation, this code is code that is generated by this script, but it does not live anywhere. It was not put in any file. It was generated, sent to the browser for rendering, and then it did not exist anywhere else. And this is the end of this presentation, in which we describe forms and form elements, which are the way for a user to communicate data to a server or an application that is sitting on a server. Thank you for your attention.